The scalding water struck Obergefreiter Hans Müller's skin like liquid fire. After 18 months in North African trenches, subsisting on brackish water and sand-crusted rations, the German corporal stood paralyzed beneath chrome showerheads in Camp Aliceville, Alabama, watching brown rivulets of accumulated filth spiral down pristine white drains. This moment of sensory shock would shatter the worldview of nearly 500,000 enemy soldiers held on American soil between 1942 and 1946. The clatter of mess kits echoed from the adjacent dining hall, mingling with the sharp scent of industrial disinfectant and the unexpected softness of terry cloth towels stacked beside porcelain wash basins. Müller pressed his palm against cool ceramic tiles, feeling their smooth surface beneath fingers that had known only mud and metal for months. The transformation had begun not with propaganda or coercion, but with something far more profound: the overwhelming evidence of American industrial capacity translated into basic human dignity. Camp Aliceville opened its gates to German prisoners in June of 1943, ultimately housing between 2,000 and 6,000 men at any given time. Within months, it had become one of the largest prisoner of war facilities in the Southeast, part of a vast archipelago of more than 500 camps scattered across 45 states. The numbers told a story that would have seemed impossible to military planners just years earlier. 425,000 Axis prisoners, mostly German, would experience American captivity on home soil. These were not the broken remnants of a defeated army, but hardened veterans of the Afrika Korps, seasoned fighters who had driven British forces back to Egypt and earned the grudging respect of Montgomery himself. They arrived thin, lice-ridden, wrapped in frontline rags that carried the stench of cordite and desperation. Many had not bathed in weeks, some in months. Their hair was matted, their skin scarred by desert sun and shrapnel, their eyes hollow from the peculiar exhaustion that comes from watching an empire crumble around you. The two-stage processing system that awaited them represented American efficiency at its methodical best. First came delousing stations, where prisoners stood naked while attendants sprayed them with DDT powder, the sharp chemical bite cutting through months of accumulated grime. Then fresh uniforms, standardized and cataloged, replacing the filthy remnants of Wehrmacht field gear. Finally, the moment that would feature in thousands of letters home: their first hot shower since capture. "The water was so hot I thought they meant to scald us," wrote Gefreiter Kurt Zimmermann in a letter to his mother that survived American censorship. "I had forgotten water could be clean, could smell of nothing but itself. The soap, real soap, not the ersatz blocks we had known, created lather like I remembered from childhood. But the shock extended beyond mere cleanliness. The shower facilities themselves defied every assumption these men had carried about American industrial capacity. Communal tiled rooms with multiple spray heads, each one fed by central boilers that served not just the showers, but latrines, kitchens, and laundry buildings across the entire compound. Water heated by systems so robust they never seemed to run cold, so abundant they seemed to flow without limit. How could a nation fighting a war on two fronts, as Nazi propaganda insisted, lavish such resources on enemy prisoners? The Geneva Convention of 1929 explicitly governed American detention policy, requiring adequate housing, clothing, medical care, and sanitary facilities for prisoners of war. But what the German captives encountered exceeded mere compliance with international law. It represented something more fundamental: the casual deployment of industrial abundance that turned basic human needs into effortless routine. Standing in those shower rooms, feeling hot water cascade over bodies that had forgotten such simple luxury, German prisoners began to confront a reality that contradicted 3 years of Nazi indoctrination. They had been told America was weak, divided, barely capable of feeding its own people while fighting a global war. Yet here, in the heart of Alabama, Enemy soldiers were receiving better medical care, more nutritious food, and more comfortable housing than many had known as civilians. The psychological implications would prove more devastating than any military defeat. These men had fought for an ideology that promised German superiority over decadent American democracy. Now, they stood naked under American showers, watching months of war wash away down American drains, while American guards handed them American towels with something approaching kindness. What they were about to discover would fundamentally alter not just their understanding of their enemy, but their conception of what industrial civilization could achieve when organized around abundance rather than conquest. The transformation awaiting them would begin with something as simple as soap and end with the complete reconstruction of their worldview. Before we dive deeper into this remarkable story, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Drop a comment below. I read every single one. And if you're finding this story as fascinating as I do, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold stories from history. The morning bugle call pierced through wooden barracks at 0600 hours, followed immediately by the clatter of mess equipment and the rustle of men stirring in double-decker bunks. Stabsgefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann opened his eyes to see electric light bulbs glowing overhead. Actual electric bulbs, not the oil lamps or candles that had illuminated his last months in North Africa. The sensory contradiction between battlefield memory and present reality would prove more psychologically disorienting than any interrogation technique. Each barrack measured approximately 20 by 40 feet, housing 40 men in double-decker bunks with individual footlockers and heated by a central furnace. The plank floors, though drafty in winter and dusty in summer, remained infinitely preferable to the mud-filled shell craters that had served as German positions during the final weeks in Tunisia. Hoffmann ran his fingers along the smooth pine boards, marveling at their uniformity, their obvious mass production in quantities that suggested unlimited timber resources. The sleeping arrangements followed military precision. 2 men per lower bunk, 2 per upper, with personal footlockers containing issued toiletries, soap, toothbrushes, shaving kits, items that had become precious luxuries during the final collapse of the Afrika Korps. Red Cross inspectors would later document these standard provisions in meticulous detail, creating an inventory of abundance that contradicted every assumption about American wartime shortages. Outside, the compound stretched across hundreds of acres, containing 200 to 400 identical barracks arranged in perfect geometric patterns. Watchtowers punctuated the perimeter, their searchlights cutting through Alabama darkness while guards' boots crunched on gravel patrol paths. The soundscape of captivity, distant sentries calling out hourly reports, the hiss of steam from the central heating plant, and the unexpected sound of German voices raised in song drifting from neighboring barracks. "We complained about drafty corners," wrote Unteroffizier Franz Keller in his diary. Can you imagine? We who had slept in frozen trenches now grumbled about inadequate heating in buildings warmer than most German homes. The morning routine began with appel. Roll call conducted twice daily by American guards who spoke functional German and maintained discipline without the casual brutality that had characterized Wehrmacht leadership in the war's final months. Missing roll call meant loss of privileges, no access to the camp library, no participation in evening theatrical performances, no eligibility for work details that offered glimpses of life beyond the wire. But what privileges they were! Camp Aliceville offered college-level courses taught by American instructors and fellow prisoners, with transcripts sometimes forwarded to German educational authorities for post-war academic credit. The camp library contained thousands of books, American classics, German literature, technical manuals, and magazines that arrived weekly from civilian publishers. Prisoners could join choirs, orchestras, theatrical troupes, and sports teams that transformed military barracks into cultural microcosms. The camp newspaper, Der Zaungast, published articles in German about camp life, American democracy, and post-war reconstruction plans. Reading rooms buzzed with quiet conversation as men discovered American perspectives on the war they had just fought, perspectives that complicated their understanding of enemy motivations and capabilities. 3,000 calories per day. The number struck German prisoners with almost physical force. Their daily rations often exceeded what many had consumed as soldiers in 1944 and 45, when Wehrmacht supply lines had collapsed and entire divisions had subsisted on emergency reserves and captured supplies. Camp kitchens prepared 3 full meals daily: beef, potatoes, fresh bread, milk, canned vegetables, and coffee that actually tasted like coffee, rather than the acorn and chicory substitutes that had become standard throughout the Reich. Prisoners assigned to kitchen duties witnessed American abundance translated into industrial-scale food preparation. Walk-in refrigerators, electric mixers, automated dishwashers, and gas ranges capable of feeding 5,000 men simultaneously. The waste alone astounded them. Perfectly edible food discarded, because regulations required 10% overproduction to ensure adequate rations for every prisoner. "We threw away more bread today than my village saw in a month," recorded Gefreiter Otto Krebs, a former hotel chef from Munich. Not spoiled bread, simply surplus. "I saved crusts in my pockets from habit, then realized the absurdity. Tomorrow would bring fresh loaves, and the day after, and every day, until the war ended." Medical facilities completed the sensory assault on Nazi preconceptions. Camp hospitals contained operating rooms, X-ray machines, and pharmacies stocked with medications that had been unavailable in Germany since 1941. Vaccination stations routinely administered preventive treatments. Prisoners suffering from scabies, lice, respiratory infections, and combat wounds received care that exceeded what most German civilians could access in their homeland. Dr. Friedrich Bauer, former chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, found himself working in facilities better equipped than most German civilian hospitals. American medical staff shared advanced techniques, used precious penicillin freely even for minor infections, and treated traumatized soldiers with counseling rather than punishment. The psychological implications cascaded through the prisoner population like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. These men had been told that American industrial capacity was insufficient to supply their own military adequately, that the United States was a soft, decadent nation on the verge of collapse. Yet they experienced daily evidence of abundance so overwhelming that American authorities could afford to treat enemies better than Germany treated its own soldiers. What did it mean when your enemy's prisoner of war camps offered better living conditions than your own military barracks? Evening brought the most disorienting experiences of all. Makeshift theaters staged German plays and cabarets, with performers building sets from scrap lumber and painting backdrops that transformed utilitarian barracks into artistic spaces. Applause echoed off wooden walls as men who had expected brutality instead found themselves attending cultural performances that would have been impressive in peacetime Berlin. Religious services created acoustic touchstones for homesick soldiers, group hymn singing in mess halls that reminded them of Christmas markets, and village churches now reduced to rubble by Allied bombing. The sounds of home, preserved and amplified in enemy captivity, while their actual homeland burned. But beneath the surface, comfort lurked darker currents that would soon transform gratitude into something far more complex and dangerous. The chrome bumpers of civilian automobiles glinted in summer heat as prison work details stepped off army trucks in downtown Montgomery, Alabama. Unteroffizier Ernst Wagner pressed his face against the vehicle's rear window, watching American shoppers emerge from air-conditioned stores, carrying paper bags filled with goods that had vanished from German shelves years earlier. These glimpses of American civilian abundance would prove more subversive than any re-education program ever devised. The Geneva Convention permitted prisoner employment in non-military labor, agriculture, timber processing, textile work, and camp maintenance. By summer 1943, thousands of German prisoners worked daily outside the wire, their labor paid in scrip and carefully monitored by American supervisors who seemed genuinely concerned with prisoner welfare. But the real impact came from what they witnessed during transportation. American towns blazing with electric lights at midnight, grocery stores stocked with meat and fresh produce, parking lots filled with civilian automobiles that ordinary workers drove to factories running 3 shifts around the clock. The sensory assault began with the bus rides themselves. Air brakes hissing at traffic lights, the sweet smell of automobile exhaust mixing with barbecue smoke from roadside diners, and the texture of vinyl seats that were more comfortable than most furniture in German homes. Prisoners assigned to agricultural work traveled through countryside that defied every assumption about wartime rationing and resource scarcity. Every farmhouse had electric lights, wrote Gefreiter Paul Fischer in a letter that survived censorship. Not oil lamps, not candles, but electric bulbs burning in multiple rooms, even during daylight hours. The farmer's teenage son drove a tractor worth more than my father earned in his entire lifetime. When I mentioned this, the boy laughed and said it wasn't even their best equipment. They were waiting for a newer model from John Deere. At Cotton Gins outside Houston, prisoners watched single machines process more raw material in 1 hour than entire German villages could handle in a month using traditional methods. The machinery ran on electricity supplied by rural electrification programs that had brought power to 90% of Texas farms by 1943. American agricultural mechanization exceeded German capabilities by margins that seemed impossible. 60 bushels of wheat per acre compared to Germany's 30 on the best land. But the most psychologically devastating revelations occurred in American factories. Though Geneva Convention rules prohibited direct war production work, prisoners could labor in industries that freed American workers for military manufacturing. This technicality allowed thousands to witness industrial capacity that made German production appear primitive by comparison. Wagner found himself unloading coal at a power plant near Detroit, where the River Rouge complex employed 100,000 workers producing jeeps, aircraft engines, and tanks. The facility consumed more electricity daily than the entire city of Hamburg. Through chain-link fencing, prisoners could see parking lots containing thousands of automobiles belonging to factory workers, ordinary laborers who owned personal vehicles, while German officers rarely possessed cars. The waste was magnificent, recorded Feldwebel Heinrich Müller, an electrical engineer, before conscription. They left lights burning in empty buildings, electric fans running in vacant rooms. It was the carelessness of infinite resources. We who had learned to hoard every scrap of metal watched Americans discard perfectly functional equipment because newer models had arrived. American abundance cascaded through prison camps via Red Cross packages containing cigarettes, chocolate, soap, and personal items that prisoners examined with wonder bordering on religious reverence. The smell of real chocolate mixed with tobacco smoke in barracks, where men shared treasures that exceeded what German civilians had seen since 1939. Yet abundance bred its own psychological complications. Many prisoners experienced what American intelligence officers termed ideological collapse syndrome, the complete breakdown of Nazi worldview when confronted with overwhelming evidence of American industrial superiority. Camp newspapers gradually shifted from defiant nationalism to discussions of democratic reconstruction. Educational programs found increasingly receptive audiences among men who could no longer deny what they witnessed daily. However, not all reactions proved positive. Some prisoners, particularly hardcore Nazi Party members, responded to American kindness with suspicion and rage. They interpreted decent treatment as weakness, viewing American humanity as confirmation of racial theories about democratic softness. These tensions would soon explode into violence that shattered the myth of universal prisoner gratitude. The darkness came on March 15, 1944, in the communal showers of Camp Papago Park, Arizona. Werner Drexler, a German sailor who had cooperated with American authorities by providing intelligence about submarine operations, was found hanging in the tiled shower room where so many prisoners had experienced their first taste of American abundance. He had been murdered by fellow prisoners who viewed his cooperation as treason. The irony was devastating. The shower facilities that symbolized American humanity had become the site of clandestine execution by prisoners who rejected that humanity. The chrome fixtures and porcelain basins that had amazed thousands now reflected the shadows of men strangled by comrades who preferred ideology to evidence. The Drexler murder revealed fault lines running through every camp. While most prisoners gradually accepted American treatment as genuine kindness, hardcore elements maintained Nazi loyalty through violence and intimidation. Shower rooms and latrines became sites of whispered threats against traitors who spoke favorably of American democracy or expressed doubts about German victory. Camp authorities responded with increased security, but the psychological damage was profound. The very facilities that had symbolized American abundance and dignity now carried undertones of menace for prisoners caught between gratitude and ideology. What would you do if faced with evidence that everything you believed was wrong, yet acknowledging that truth meant betraying everything you had fought for? The question haunted every prisoner who stood beneath those showerheads, feeling hot water cascade over skin scarred by a war that now seemed increasingly pointless. They had experienced American kindness, witnessed American abundance, and seen American industrial capacity that dwarfed German achievements. But accepting these truths meant confronting the possibility that their entire struggle had served criminals rather than heroes. As 1944 progressed and news of D-Day reached the camps, prisoners would face their final reckoning with the evidence of their own eyes. The newsreel footage flickered across a makeshift screen in Camp Aliceville's mess hall on June 10, 1944, 4 days after Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy. 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, 150,000 men in the first wave. Numbers that demonstrated organizational capacity beyond anything the Wehrmacht had ever achieved. Watching their homeland crushed by the very nation they had been told was too weak to fight, German prisoners experienced their final ideological collapse in a communal shower of truth. The sound of men weeping echoed off mess hall walls as the scope of D-Day became clear. These were not tears of patriotic defiance, but the profound grief that comes from recognizing that everything you believed was a lie. Obergefreiter Friedrich von Tauben wrote in his diary, "We knew then that everything was lost, not just the war, but our entire understanding of the world. We had challenged the Earth's greatest industrial power with fairy tales and racial mythology." The scent of disinfectant still lingered in shower rooms, where these revelations crystallized into personal transformation. Men who had arrived as fanatical Nazis now requested American newspapers, enrolled in democracy courses, and wrote letters home describing industrial abundance that their families dismissed as enemy propaganda. The chrome fixtures and porcelain basins that had initially amazed them now served as daily reminders of systematic deception by their own leadership. American authorities documented increasing numbers of prisoners seeking educational opportunities. Over 25,000 enrolled in programs ranging from English language instruction to agricultural science, taught by American college professors and civilian volunteers. The University of Chicago provided correspondence courses. Stanford University sent lecturers to discuss constitutional government and free market economics. They treated us not as enemies, but as students, recalled Hermann Guthmann in a 1975 interview. Jewish refugees from Germany taught us physics and mathematics without hatred. They spoke of science as belonging to all humanity, not any single race. This generosity toward enemies was incomprehensible to minds shaped by Nazi vindictiveness. The camp theaters that had once staged German plays now featured American films: Gone with the Wind, The Grapes of Wrath, Casablanca. Prisoners watched in amazement as Americans openly depicted their own failures and social problems to enemy captives. This intellectual honesty, this willingness to show weakness alongside strength, contradicted every assumption about democratic societies. Christmas 1944 brought the most profound psychological impact yet. American churches, civic organizations, and private citizens sent 500,000 Christmas packages to German prisoners, enemies whose countrymen were still fighting American soldiers. Each package contained cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and handmade items that spoke of individual Americans taking time to remember foreign prisoners. The sensory memory of that Christmas would haunt former prisoners for decades. The rustle of tissue paper, the smell of real chocolate, the texture of hand-knitted scarves made by American women whose sons were dying in European battles. Local Methodist choirs performed German Christmas carols for men who had tried to kill Americans months earlier. This Christian charity toward enemies shattered the final remnants of Nazi racial theory. But the true reckoning came with war's end. May 8, 1945, marked Germany's surrender. But most prisoners remained in American camps for months while repatriation was organized. During this liminal period, they received vocational training, agricultural education, and political instruction about democratic reconstruction. American authorities prepared them not for punishment, but for participation in rebuilding their destroyed nation. The men who boarded ships for Germany in 1946 were fundamentally different from those who had arrived 3 years earlier. They had witnessed democratic prosperity firsthand, experienced industrial abundance as daily reality, and learned that strength could coexist with mercy. They returned to a Germany divided, destroyed, and destitute, but carrying knowledge of how democratic societies functioned. Many former prisoners rose to prominence in West Germany's reconstruction. Hans Krull, held at Camp Shelby, became West German ambassador to the United States. Walter Hallstein, who taught classes at Camp Como, served as president of the European Commission. They brought American methods to German industry, American efficiency to German agriculture, and American democratic ideals to German politics. The economic miracle that transformed West Germany in the 1950s was built partly on foundations laid in American prison camps. Former prisoners established businesses using production techniques observed in American factories. They implemented agricultural methods learned on Iowa farms. They advocated for democratic institutions based on systems they had studied during captivity. We learned that prosperity came from freedom, not conquest. Hans Krull wrote in his memoirs, "Democracy created wealth through cooperation rather than coercion." These lessons, learned as prisoners, shaped the new Germany we built from ruins. The shower rooms where this transformation began became symbols of something unprecedented in military history: the conversion of enemies through abundance rather than force. Chrome fixtures and porcelain basins had accomplished what propaganda never could: the complete ideological reconstruction of an entire generation. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of war's end, surviving German prisoners held a reunion in Austin, Texas. Over 500 former prisoners returned to America, many bringing families to see where their transformation had begun. They toured reconstructed camps, visited families who had sent Christmas packages, and reflected on a captivity that had become liberation. Former Obergefreiter Hans Weber, who had worked on Nebraska farms during his imprisonment, spoke at the reunion dinner. "We came to America as enemies, as Nazis, as believers in a lie. We left as friends, as Democrats, as men who had seen the truth." America's true weapon was not its bombs or tanks, but its inexhaustible capacity for creation and unshakable confidence in human dignity. The transformation had been complete and lasting. The statistics tell the final story. Of 371,683 German prisoners held in America, fewer than 1% attempted escape. 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent. Thousands maintained correspondence with American families for decades after the war. Many eventually immigrated to the United States, bringing their children to see the camps where their fathers learned democracy. The German prisoners who experienced American industrial might and democratic humanity became unwitting ambassadors of transformation. Their journey from Nazi warriors to democratic citizens remains one of the most remarkable psychological reconstructions in modern history, accomplished not through force or propaganda, but through the overwhelming evidence of what free people could achieve when they worked together. In the end, America's greatest victory was not on any battlefield, but in those tiled shower rooms where the simple dignity of hot water and soap dissolved the ideological chains of totalitarianism. The men who stood beneath those chrome showerheads, feeling months of war wash away, emerged as architects of a democratic Germany allied with the nation they had once tried to destroy. They had come as conquerors and left as converts, transformed by abundance into apostles of democracy.